So welcome to our latest Hampstead how-tos. Okay, so in this video we're going to be talking about how exit tickets can be used to facilitate responsive teaching and formative assessment. Now, as always, there is a how-to sheet to go along with it. So again, you might find it useful to print that out or have that with you. But this kind of like condenses and summarizes most of the key ideas from the video. So that is also in the YouTube video description below, so you can get it as a PDF off of there. From Google Drive. Now, exit tickets are very much tied to one of our key curriculum principles at Hampstead, which is about how we use assessment. So, the key part about assessment at Hampstead is that we want to use assessment to allow teachers to identify misconceptions and make our teaching more responsive and not be excessive or onerous. Okay, so we want the majority of our assessment to be formative. It's about informing next steps and allowing teachers to catch misconceptions before they can become embedded. And exit tickets are a very good strategy for facilitating that. Now, the problem that we often have in teaching is we know that the theory is that the way teaching should kind of work is that you look at students' work, you mark it or you respond to it in some way. You then plan based upon what the students have done in a responsive way. You then teach on the basis of that. And you repeat. So that should be sort of like the golden thread, as it were, or cycle. Now, the problem we know in reality is that that isn't really what happens, that we have our pre-planned lessons and that we get very quickly buried in marking, and we often feel guilty because we know that our teaching isn't as responsive as we'd hope it would be, because it is very, very difficult to keep up with marking books, especially as a method of feedback. Now, exit tickets are a very good way of kind of like solving that problem. So in simple terms, what is an exit ticket? So an exit ticket is a short encapsulating task which shows how well all students have understood the lesson's key ideas. Now, I say encapsulating task because usually an exit ticket will literally be a small piece of paper with a question or a short task for students to do that summarizes the key ideas from that lesson, but it doesn't have to be, okay? But it's just some kind of short encapsulating task that allows you to gauge how well students have understood the lesson's key ideas. They're very, very good for assessing whether students have gained key skills that are meant to be required in lessons, core or key knowledge, and also what are called threshold concepts. Okay, so key ideas that you want to make sure students understand before you move on next lesson. And they're very, very good for making your plenaries much more purposeful and also for allowing you to create starters which are responsive to students. Now, I didn't really like exit tickets that I read about them properly because I think when I saw them before, I used to think that they looked like quite a gimmicky kind of add-on in lessons. And I think that was because when I'd seen them used in lessons by teachers, they seemed like a slightly faddy and performative accountability measure that you get observed and then you get the kids to write down what did you learn today, and then you could use that to show the person observing you what that the kids had learned something. But now that I've read a bit more about them and I've really embedded them in my teaching and thought about them, they're very central to a lot of my lessons. And I find them particularly useful for that lesson-to-lesson planning where you're kind of like trying to look at what the kids have done in the previous lesson before you plan your next one. So I think they're a really excellent tool for doing that. And some of the research on exit tickets, so Harry Fletcher Wood, who a lot of the ideas in the video today are taken from, he describes in his book Responsive Teaching, which is all about how to actually carry out formative assessment in practice. He argues that exit tickets are a powerful and importantly time-efficient tool for teachers to assess student learning, so he thinks they're an excellent tool to facilitate formative assessment. Likewise, Doug Lemoff in Teach Like a Champion talks about exit tickets allowing us to objectively measure our impact on students as well as identify student misconceptions and errors before they become embedded. So again, he's a very big advocate of using exit tickets. I think it's probably worthwhile also keeping in mind Dylan Williams' definition about what formative assessment is. Okay, so formative assessment is when teachers use evidence of student learning to adapt teaching and learning or instruction to meet student needs. So the key thing about formative assessment is that it's got to be then what you're kind of learning from the assessment is actually being used to change your teaching in some way. And the point about that is that you obviously want to assess as often as possible so you can respond. And I think exit tickets are a very good method for giving you feedback in a way that is very quick to mark and analyze and then respond to. And I think in that way, exit tickets are a very good, what I'd see as a kind of bridge. Okay, they're a good bridge between the sort of idealism, I suppose, of teaching theory and then the nitty gritty kind of reality of like what it's like to teach on a 42 period timetable. So I think it's very, very good for a very good practical technique for sort of bridging that gap between theory and practice, which we know exists in teaching in reality. Now, I think there's a few key benefits to exit tickets. I think one key one actually is not so much even about the responsiveness of what you do with exit tickets, but actually the impact that they have on your planning. I think when you try and come up with an exit ticket, so a question or one key task to summarize the learning in the lesson, it really helps us to clarify our objectives for that lesson. If you find when you make an exit ticket that coming up with a question or a single task to encapsulate the learning, it probably means your learning objectives for that lesson are either too nebulous, or maybe they're too numerous, or maybe you're being too ambitious with how much you're trying to get students to learn in one lesson. And I think the other thing that's really good about exit tickets with your planning is once you've really narrowed down a tight key learning objective for that lesson, it also means you kind of sometimes go and back engineer the rest of your lesson. So once you know that's the key idea, that's the thing I need to really make sure the overwhelming majority of students understand before I move on next time. It sometimes means that you sort of go back through your PowerPoint or your lesson plan and you sort of say, actually, do I really need that video? Is that a distraction? Or actually, maybe I haven't really got a diagram which really illustrates this key idea that well. It's very, very good for kind of helping you think about, in terms of cognitive load, what is extraneous in your lesson, things which are actually not servicing your core lesson objective that you could get rid of, and adding to your germane load. Okay, so if this is the key idea that we know all students want to get to, have you actually focused enough of the activities and content in your lesson on that key idea? So I think they're really, really good for kind of clarifying your lesson objectives, but then also for actually back engineering your lesson sometimes to come up with better activities. I actually will now sometimes start with an exit ticket and work my way back from there, because I just think it's a very good tool for designing tight lesson objectives. Another key thing about exit tickets is they're an objective measure of success. We quite often as teachers overestimate how well things have gone on the basis of quite poor proxies, like the students looked like they were looking at me, they were engaged, they nodded a lot, things like this, which actually are quite poor proxies for actually how well students actually understood key ideas. And I think what exit tickets do is they overcome that and they give you a more objective standard, right? That you can hold yourself accountable to. If you say, this is the question I want most students to be able to answer by the end of the lesson, this is a model answer, that then gives you a standard to actually judge your teaching again, which is much more objective. And in that way, exit tickets really hold a mirror up to your own teaching in a way that can be quite powerful, I think. And also, I think the other key benefit we've already kind of mentioned is that they facilitate responsive teaching. Looking through a class set of exit tickets will take you maximum 15 minutes. And what that then means is that you can much more regularly respond to gaps in students' knowledge and understanding in your lessons. So again, I think they're really, really good at making responsive teaching something much more manageable on a heavy teaching timetable. Now, there's a few key criteria of what make a good exit ticket. So these are on your handout how-to sheet, which you'll leave with at the end. So there's three key things really for a good exit ticket. It's got to allow you to make valid inferences about students' learning. It's got to give you useful data, and it's got to be focused. So there are kind of combined 7 key criteria that go into those three. So the first one is that ideally with a good exit ticket, you want to differentiate accurately between different levels of understanding. So you want to try and come up with a question or a task that allows you to sort of differentiate between students who've understood something really well, partially, and basically not gotten it at all. You also want to create tasks or questions that elicit misconceptions. So you want to kind of engineer questions that are really going to allow you to see if students have got misconceptions that you predict they might well have and that you've tried to prevent through the kind of way you've taught the lesson. Okay, so you want to try and design exit tickets to elicit misconceptions if you can. You want to try and make sure that it encapsulates all the key things from the lesson, which can be quite hard to do sometimes, but you want to try and make sure it focuses on all the key things from the lesson. You also wanted to zoom in and focus on the key point. Okay, so what is the key idea or the key concept that you really need to make sure all students understand before you move on next lesson? And also you've got to make sure that the exit ticket has enough structure to elicit a clear response. If you have a really, really kind of vague question or a task that is just a bit too open and not structured, or there's not enough it's not clear how much they're meant to write, etc. It can be harder to actually, like, for them to create a response you can then compare with others. So you've got to have enough structure to give you a clear response. And finally, it's got to be focused, and there's two parts to that. One is it's got to be swift for the students to answer, and secondly, it's got to be swift for you to mark / read as a teacher. So just to look at a few examples of exit tickets now. Now, in terms of thinking about our checklist, so these are 3 iterations of a exit ticket that could be designed for an English lesson where students are looking at the skill of apostrophes. Okay. Now, this is an example of a poor exit ticket. So you have a question at the end of this lesson would be, when should an apostrophe be used? Now, if we think about that question, there's a few things that are wrong with it. One thing is that, is it going to be swift to answer? Possibly not, because students are probably going to meander along. Some will write a lot, some will barely write any. That probably means it's not going to include very much useful data, because there's not enough structure in it as a question to really allow me to kind of compare students. And it's also not very well designed in terms of eliciting misconceptions about apostrophe or allowing us to differentiate between different levels of understanding for students. We could then upgrade that to this one. So we could then say instead, right, here's 4 sentences. I would like you to tick or cross each of these sentences, depending on whether you think they've used apostrophes correctly or not, or whether they've misplaced them. Now, in the case of this one, this is definitely a lot better this time. Okay, there's more structure to it, certainly. It definitely would be able to elicit misconceptions, and it would certainly be swift to answer and swift to mark. But in the case of this one, we could possibly say it's not as well designed as it could be in terms of differentiating between different levels of understanding, and also potentially it would fall down because it's not actually that challenging, because you can sort of tick across it, maybe you get it right, maybe you don't. It's not as clear necessarily as students have guessed the right answers or not. If we look at the 3rd iteration of that same exit ticket, you've partly blocked off my Loon video. So we've got, he's very angry, the dogs are unhappy, and it's on its way, the lady's car. Now, the point about this last exit ticket is that each of these questions, and so what they have, each of these sentences, they have to add an apostrophe if it's necessary to each of these sentences. And the point is that each kind of sentence stem is based upon a misconception about apostrophes. So the point is that you can track from how students respond on that which misconceptions they hold. So again, it's very swift to answer, swift to mark. It's very well designed, and it also has a higher demand in terms of thinking, because students have really got to think quite hard about whether apostrophe should be included or not. Sorry, that's a bit obscured. If you go to the video link description with the how-to videos there, these example exit tickets can be found in there. If we look at another one, so if we were imagining, like, say, a Year 7 lesson on fractions, okay, right, you might want to test students' ability at the end of that lesson to add fractions. Maybe that's been the focus of the lesson. So you could give them a simple exit ticket with 2 fraction questions, which are typical of the ones they've been looking at that day. So you've got 2 over 7 plus 3 over 7 equals, and then we've got 1 over 5 plus 2 over 6. Now, in terms of like this exit ticket, this first version, there's a few strengths of it. It's definitely going to be swift to answer for the students and swift to mark for you as a teacher. It's going to allow you to differentiate between different levels of understanding, because you're going to be able to see which students can add when the denominator is the same and which ones are able to when they're different. So there's 2 levels of understanding we'll be able to differentiate with that one. But we could, with that one, make it even more diagnostic. We could differentiate even more levels of understanding and elicit more misconceptions. So in the case of this one, what you could do is you could create 3 levels of understanding. So you could test, first of all, what were which students were able to add together fractions when the denominators were the same, which ones, like in this one, were able to do when the denomination was different. But then you can add a 3rd layer of understanding, is what can they do when the total sum of the fraction adds up to more than 1. So we've now got 3 levels of understanding. It's a very well designed exit ticket. You would be able to pile up those exit tickets into different categories of student in terms of which misconceptions they held for those questions. So that would be an excellent exit ticket that really encapsulated the key learning objective. Now, there are some other ones on here which from other subjects, which I will not talk through, but again, if you look on your how-to sheet, you can find those examples on there. So you've got, for example, some English literature, French, and also physics. Now, once you've got your well-designed exit ticket, What you do with it afterwards is obviously very important. Okay, remember the whole point about formative assessment is not to get students just to write on something, a bit of paper. You are then using it to responsively teach them. Okay, so after you've collected in your exit tickets, what you want to do is use the feedback from those to shape your next lesson. Now, what you then want to do is a routine called divide, dig, and decide. Okay, so what you do with your exit tickets is you first of all collect them all in, and what I just do with them, because they usually are just paper ones with me with usually a single question, is you put the exit tickets into 3 piles. Got it, partially got it, didn't get it. Or maybe like with that maths example, you can have much more specific kind of categories of understanding for each one. So you've got clearly got it, partially got it, didn't get it at all. That already gives you a rough shot of how well students understood the core content in that lesson. Now, what you then want to do is you want to dig into those no and maybe piles and look for patterns in errors or common misconceptions. So this is where you're sort of trying to think about where have students gone wrong? Are there patterns here I can spot in terms of why they've not been able to complete the exit ticket completely correctly? And then the really important stage, this is the most important one really, is once you've gathered that data, you think, right, based upon looking at those exit tickets, are they ready to move on? Okay, you might find if 95% of them have gotten it right to a very good standard, your feedback is really next lesson you can say, great job, here's one really good exit ticket, but actually you guys understood that really well, we're ready to move on. Okay, if there are patterns there about misconceptions that need to be addressed or common errors, okay, think about activities you can use to start off your next lesson that can respond to those misconceptions that you've discovered. Okay, so then you're thinking about, well, what activities could I do in that lesson to address that misconception or that error that came up? And then there's a few things that you can obviously do. So as we've already said, if they all got it right, you can just move on. If at the other extreme, all the students got the answer wrong, actually your feedback might be you just need to reteach the lesson. Okay, so those are kind of 2 extremes. Okay, in practice though, what normally happens is you get some students get it right and some get it wrong. That's the most likely outcome when you do an exit ticket. Okay, now different things you can do with that. You could just at the start of next lesson briefly revise some of the key points. Okay, so if there was 1 or 2 key ideas that a lot of students didn't get, you could just explain it in a different way or re-emphasize it or reteach it. You can share a model of a student answer and then talk about what makes it good. So you can pick out the 1 or 2 best exit tickets and then talk through, right, these ones are outstanding. A lot of you didn't quite get this idea yet. You can use that as a model to talk about it. You could get a exit ticket which was partially correct but not fully, and then as a class you could improve it either under a visualizer or you could photocopy it and print it out for students. You can rag the exit tickets if you want, so you could color code them between outstanding, partially got it but with a target, or didn't get it at all, and then you can get them to actually try and improve their work or their exit ticket using that feedback. Or you could just make a note to sit down with those students who've struggled at some point. So that's particularly true. If you only get a few students who've quite a specific misconception, you might think it's not actually appropriate for whole class teaching, but you make a note at some point to make sure to go and sit down and talk to them about it. Yeah. But the point is that you are doing things in response to these exit tickets. Now I'm just going to model kind of like one example of the process. I'm going to try not get too caught up in the kind of like history behind it, because I'm just using it really as an example exit ticket. So in a year 10 lesson I was doing with my students, and we were learning about the Chinese Revolution for their Cold War paper. And the key idea I really decided was about, we kind of learned about the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, the takeover, the Civil War, and then the kind of impact that the Chinese Revolution had on relations with America. And I decided that, okay, although we covered quite a lot, the key idea that they really needed to understand before they moved on was why the USA saw the Chinese Revolution as a major threat. And I knew that as a teacher because in the next future lessons, they're going to be learning about the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and they can't really understand those things without getting the idea that the revolution in China was the thing that set those events off, because it gave a platform for the communists to spread into Asia. So what I did here is I wrote out a model response about this is what I want to see as an ideal response for students. That gives me a standard to then compare to what the students write. And it also means I then kind of go, actually, if this is kind of what the key idea I want them all to get by the end of the lesson, are my lesson materials and so forth focused enough on that idea? Okay, so that gives me a nice standard to hold myself accountable to. What I then did is I did my divide, dig and decide. Okay, so I just on a table, I'll just go through and say, right, didn't quite get it, partially got it, and I usually then separate from this pile of got it a couple of outstanding ones I might want to use as models, okay? I sometimes, if I'm going to rag it, I'll share this with students, say, right, if you've got this colour, that's the exit ticket. Doing all of this, honestly, only takes about 15 minutes, right? You sort them in the piles, you then just have a couple of highlighters, you put a little dash in the corner. It's actually quite easy to do. And I've already got an instant snapshot there about how well the lesson's gone. So I can say, right, well, half of them got it really, really well. Maybe another 30-40% in the middle got at least some of the ideas, but not all of them. Only a couple of them didn't get the key idea at all. Okay, so again, that gives me a rough initial snapshot. So I've divided the students up, and then don't always have to do this, but I actually quite like with exit tickets to actually record in my mark book with a tick, a dash, or a cross, which students could do it or couldn't. And I just think it's quite a nice thing to have in there, just to sort of get a sense of like which students are kind of just getting the key ideas each lesson. And so it's a nice bit of data to have in your mark book, but it's not very demanding because it's not an exam question. So I really strongly recommend with exit tickets, when you start with them, actually just recording your mark book, right, with the tick, dash, or cross, whether the students got it or not. It's really useful over time for sort of spotting patterns, right? So you might see, for example, maybe there are students who are doing really well on the exit tickets, but then on the applied exam questions, they're not. So that suggests to you where the problem lies. It's clearly something about the application of the knowledge rather than the knowledge itself. Likewise, if students are completely bombing across the board, that shows there's clearly a problem there, even in terms of them accessing the work or their attitude or whatever it is. So I think that recording it in your mark book is quite a good habit, but certainly don't always feel like you have to do it. They can still be really useful without recording it in your mark book. So I picked out a couple of exemplars, which I wanted to share with the class next time from these two students here. I won't share their names, okay? So I thought, right, these two were excellent. These two, used all of the keywords, which I asked them to use in their exit ticket, and they clearly really understood the key ideas. And I thought, right, I'll share these next time. I'll celebrate their success with the class. One key thing about when you sort of begin implementing exit tickets is it's really important to really celebrate good ones with the classes, because it kind of means that they actually come to quite like exit tickets. They like the feedback when their exit ticket gets to be the one on the board next lesson. So my classes know when they've done an exit ticket last time that I'm going to give points to the two best ones, and they do kind of anticipate actually like who's going to be the one. So that's quite a nice ritual to get into, just to sort of say, right, these two were excellent, here's what made them really good. That's a nice way to start with a bit of feedback. But then I sort of did my digging. So I kind of went through the ones where there were common kind of misconceptions. And one I spotted on a few exit tickets was that a few students had sentences along these lines. So they said the main reason why China was seen as a threat was because they came part of the USSR. So they had this misconception that China and the Soviet Union had kind of become the same country instead of actually what I taught them, which was about them becoming allies. And then what I kind of did is I went back to my lesson and said, well, where might that have come from? And I sort of looked back from my PowerPoint and I thought, when I was explaining the alliance between the Soviet Union and China with the Treaty of Friendship, that I'd use this map to illustrate the idea. And I thought, well, actually, that's quite clear where that misconception's coming from. Digging through those exit tickets, I wouldn't have spotted that otherwise, probably till like an end of unit exam or something, that misconception existed. But I could then go back and say, right, that's where that misconception came from, and I can make a note to address it and correct it in the next lesson. So again, a very kind of micro bit of knowledge, and something I wouldn't have picked up on without the exit ticket. And likewise, a couple of other things, a lot of students kind of getting the key idea but not really using the key terminology, and particularly not really understanding how the Truman Doctrine was violated by the Chinese Revolution, and that being a key idea. So I thought, actually, I need to next time revisit the Truman Doctrine, because quite a few of them couldn't really use that in their explanation. So I'll make sure that in the lesson I do that. And likewise, a common thing was that a couple of the brightest students actually didn't get the point about an exit ticket, is that there's a sort of challenge of concision, that a few of them had used the keywords and so forth, but they'd gone over the word limit. So I made a note to next time emphasize that you've got to try and get it in the space, because that's actually part of the intellectual challenge here. So then I've done my dividing, I've done my digging through the exit tickets. I've then decided on a few bits of formative action next lesson in response to what I've read. So I'm going to get students to add to their exit tickets using the two exemplars. I'm going to put those on the board. I'm then going to include a map that emphasises that China and the USSR were separate countries to address that misconception that came up there. And I'm just going to briefly revisit the Truman Doctrine and explain quite more explicitly why it was violated by the Chinese Revolution. So I've decided on a few little micro tweaks that I'm going to use in my Start Next lesson, which are very responsive to what the students have done. Just to finish up, a couple of do's and don'ts for using exit tickets. Now, I think a really good do, especially when you start doing exit tickets, is to write out a model response. Actually, scrap that. Not even when you start. I think it's really good with exit tickets in general to always try and write out a model response. That's because writing it can kind of make you see, well, actually, is this a good, clear enough question? Is it focused enough on what I want it to focus on? And once you've got the completed kind of model, you've got a standard to hold yourself accountable for, and then also kind of like something to sort of back engineer your lessons against, right? And because you've got that, this is the key idea, right? It just really helps clarify your thinking and then refine your lesson planning. It can also be good with exit tickets to sort of discuss and reflect on with the colleagues, to sort of say, well, look, can you think about how else I could reframe this maybe to differentiate amongst the students? Is it too challenging? Is it not challenging enough? That can be very, very useful. Economy of language as well. Don't make the question or the task too long. Be quite specific with what you want them to do. Celebrate students' work and their mistakes. So as well as celebrating those exemplar ones, with ones where there are common misconceptions, say, right, brilliant, this is really useful because actually this was a mistake that lots of you made, and I'm really grateful for that because that means we can fix it now before you guys go away thinking that this was the case. Okay, so celebrate both errors as well as like examples of really great student work. It can also be good with exit tickets to include criteria sometimes. So whether that's just like in my one, include 3 of these key words, or if it's an English exit ticket, it might be use 3 points from the text to back up your answer. Or if we're doing maths, it could be show you're working. So sometimes including like a very simple criteria for your exit ticket can be good as well. Also as well, make it visually appealing and limit the space for a response. Okay, I'll put in the video description my model one, so you can start from that if you want to. I think limiting the space is quite important because that makes it easier for you to mark, because you're kind of like making the students kind of like do that space. And by making it visually appealing, it kind of makes them value it more. If you just have a few bits of randomly cut up paper, the students aren't going to value it. If it's a nice curated exit ticket, they're more likely to take it seriously and respond the way you want them to. And then finally, like I said earlier, recording it in your mark book can be good when you start off using exit tickets to spot those patterns of misconceptions, or students who are behind or who are doing really well, etc. Some don'ts: don't make the questions too vague or open. So there's a balance to be struck there. But if you, like with the apostrophes example, have a question like that, it's not really going to allow you to be swift to answer, and it's not necessarily going to give you very useful data. So try and make the question quite clear for students. Okay. Don't make them on the fly as well, okay? That coming up with a tight learning objective and a well-crafted question, that takes time. I have done this before. I've tried to come up with an exit ticket a couple of minutes before the lesson. It doesn't usually work. So think carefully about the question, the exit ticket before the lesson. In some ways, probably the most important one on here, don't get students to do exit passes if you're not going to read and respond to them. Remember, the whole point about exit tickets is to facilitate responsive teaching. If you're not actually going to read them to get a sense of what students have learned and what they haven't, or design activities in response to them, don't bother doing them because it defeats the purpose of them, and it will make students value them less when they see that you're not actually using them to do anything with them. If a lot of them haven't gotten it, don't convey exasperation, because again, it is feedback on your teaching ultimately, and I think it's really important to lower the stakes with exit tickets to say, look, I need to see whether you've gotten this key idea or not, and this is really useful feedback for me as a teacher. So don't convey exasperation if lots of them don't get it. And linked to that as well, don't make it high stakes. To finish off then, just a couple of bits of further reading if you want to read more about exit tickets. And I think the single best one is Harry Fletcher Wood's Responsive Teaching. Chapter 4 of that is entirely dedicated to how to design really outstanding exit tickets. A lot of the ideas inform this kind of presentation, so have a look at that. That is in the Hampstead Staff CPD library. There's a very good blog, which again I'll put in the YouTube video description below, from the Improving Teaching blog, which is by Harry Fletcher Wood, talking about how to design exit tickets. And then there's also a very useful chartlet from Doug Lemos' blog about how to design and also analyze exit tickets effectively. So I hope you found that useful. Remember, you've got the how-to exit ticket guide at the bottom. You've also got the guides to further reading. And yep, I look forward to seeing some excellent exit tickets in response.